In this video, I want to introduce you to critical race psychology. I'm going to take you through 6 ways of looking at psychological facts or psychological phenomena, things that we believe as psychologists or psychology students. So 6 ways of examining those facts in a critical race psychology perspective. In other words, by following these 6 steps or these 6 ways of looking at psychological information or psychological history, psychological knowledge and understanding, you will be taking a critical race psychology perspective. So the very first part of adopting a critical race psychology perspective is the critical component. And so when you're looking at something critically, you're not just thinking critically. In other words, you understand what a concept means, you understand the context in which the concept has occurred and sort of where it comes from, but you're also challenging those things. So you ask the question, could it have been another way? So when you think critically, so as a critical psychologist, and I don't just mean the way we talk about critical thinking more broadly, but as you think like a critical psychologist, you challenge the knowledge that we have, or the knowledge that's often taken for granted. And I just want to give a really simple example. There's 3 that come to mind. One would be the psychology of memory, the psychology of perception, and the psychology of depression or psychopathology of depression. So with memory, we believe that you and I store memories of actual events, like me sitting right here in this couch with my black lab, I don't know if you can see her, sitting next to me, that in a week or so, I can call this up, almost like double clicking on a file on my desktop, and it pulling up this memory that occurred, and so I can see and smell and feel and taste and kind of know what happened. Notice what I've just done. I've described memory from a psychological perspective that borrows a computational metaphor. Now, in psychology, we are limited in our understanding of memory to the way that memory works on a computer. Now, you know that humans are not computers. Humans have all sorts of other experiences that distort our memory of what happened when we were 6 or 7. A computer hard drive can either recover a file or not. Human memory works very differently. But if you read textbooks about human memory, what you'll find are all of the words that we use to describe computers. Things like coding, storage, retrieval, and even the way we say memory or think about memory, we imagine a little USB thumb drive of all of our memories and trying to access them. So all these words come from a computational metaphor. So they were borrowed from 1960s technology. So how might a critical psychologist look at this? Well, when we think about memory as though it were happening in a computer, what do we miss out on? What do we misunderstand? How does it distort our understanding of human memory? So a critical psychologist tries to unpack or remove the computational metaphor from the understanding of memory. And when you do that, by the way, in psychology, we don't know much about human memory. So remove the computational metaphor, and there's almost nothing left that we know about memory, which shows us that we are deeply dependent on this metaphor. So I gave the example of memory. How about perception? Well, when you and I see something, we understand, based on this is a 19th century neuroscience, we understand that our eyes are like lenses, kind of like a telescope. If we're looking through, or a microscope, looking at something and magnifying it, or a telescope, looking at something out there and magnifying the distance that we can see, we believe that our eyes are taking images and transforming them onto our retinas, and that this information, what does that mean, passes into our optic nerve, optic chiasm, and onto our occipital cortexes, and then our brain interprets the image to have some sort of meaningful significance. And all of this happens in perception, and we take that for granted. That conception hasn't changed in 160 years. We've just understood that that's how perception works. But there are so many transformations that occur. So from a spectral image made of light photons, we have a nervous impulse that passes. So all that our optic nerve can do is send nervous signals, nervous images, so little pulses on our nerves through our synaptic vesicles or through our synapses. So that transformation is happening. We don't really understand how a spectral image is translated into nervous impulses. We just know that it happens. And then once it reaches our occipital cortex, how does our brain interpret it to see an image? Wouldn't a nervous impulse of a light be the same as a nervous impulse for a sound or a smell? And indeed, they are, which is why sensory synesthesia is possible, how people can feel a sound or see a smell. This does happen. This distortion does happen in people. But we are limited in our understanding of perception by the understanding that our eyes work like cameras. So our brain works like a computer. Our eyes work like cameras. When we believe this way of thinking about memory and perception, we are limited. So we are held back from understanding more deeply what's actually happening with human memory and human perception. So I've given those two examples just to kind of show you how looking at something that we all know to be true, but looking at these critically challenges whether we actually know anything about them at all. So we are deeply limited in our understanding. The final example that I gave was with depression. And in the United States today, or in the West, we believe that depression is a problem, and so that feelings of sadness, feelings of insecurity or inferiority, feelings of doom and inability to succeed or feelings of failure, that these are bad, that we shouldn't have them. Well, that belief right there, it's a belief, by the way, that we should be happy, we should feel successful, we should feel capable and full of potential, and that any limits to those represents a physiological problem inside of us. So if someone is feeling down or having low energy and feeling like maybe the job that they wanted to do in their life is too difficult and they need to choose something different, that there's something physically wrong with them that needs to be corrected by medicine. That is one of the most inherent beliefs about psychopathology in our country. Could it be another way? In other words, what would it look like if instead of calling depression something bad, we accepted depression as an ordinary part of human life, the sphere of human existence? That depression is a phase that we typically pass through, but that has an endpoint, and that we get out of it after sometimes 2 weeks, sometimes 2 years, but not pathologizing it as a problem. When I say that, it probably strikes you as absurd. Oh, no, depression is horrible, we need to get rid of it. But that right there is an ideology. We believe that you and I ought to be happy, and that belief fuels this idea that depression should be avoided. Now, if we look at the statistics, the majority of adults in the United States are on some sort of psychotropic medication. So we're looking at 45% are on depression or anxiety, and that number jumps to like 80% when we're talking about people in your life, so either yourself or others. The belief is so pervasive that the majority of all American adults, are on some sort of medication to treat so-called mood disorders. And again, we call them mood disorders because we believe that we should be in a good mood. But what if we didn't believe that? What would happen to our understanding of psychopathology? Well, most of the DSM would disappear. And so when we look at something critically in psychology, we challenge the belief systems associated with it. But wait a minute, depression has been scientifically proven. Well, remember, asking the question, actually, when depression is scientifically demonstrated, you begin with an assumption about what depression is, and depression happens to be 7 observable behavioral symptoms. Now, we haven't talked about whether or not those are good or bad. That's the ideology. And so when it's performed scientifically or when it's tested experimentally, we assume that these symptoms represent depression, and we assume that depression is bad. That is never subject to scientific scrutiny, whether or not depression is good or bad. It's just assumed. And when I say depression is good, it sounds preposterous because of how strong the belief is in our country. All right, so we've looked at memory, perception, and depression from a critical psychological lens. But what about critical race psychological lens? And I want to take you through 6 ways of examining, we're just going to look at depression, 6 ways of examining depression from a critical race psychology perspective. So the first step in looking at any aspect of psychology from this perspective is to recognize that some actions and behaviors and patterns in psychology are privileged. So we privilege, for example, in depression, we privilege feeling good, we privilege happiness, we privilege feeling capable and strong and vibrant and so on. So in our culture, these things are held in very high esteem, and not just as exceptional traits, as normal traits. So we have normalized this superior feeling, or these superior feelings, so that if you do not feel superior on any given day, then there's something the matter with you. Now, how could that be different? Well, what if I was feeling good and had a very low score on a depression inventory, that was considered exceptional, and having moderate depression was considered normal, and having severe depression was considered abnormal? That would be a very different curve than we have right now, which is exceptional is normal and moderate is severely abnormal. And so, who does that privilege? Take a step back. Who does that belief system privilege in our society? I don't have a good answer for you. I have to ask you that question. Who does this belief that feeling good and being capable and having a low depression score on some arbitrary inventory is a good thing or is valuable? Who does that privilege? And then who does that hold in lower esteem or underprivilege? Think about having an illness or having a cognitive disorder or a physiological disorder. Anything that would make your life a little bit harder would be likely to contribute to depression, and it would make you more likely to therefore become disordered or abnormal. And so in critical race psychology, we look at who is already being discriminated against in a system or in a society. And so we think of people of color in our country. They have a harder time getting jobs. When they do get the jobs, they on average get paid less for those jobs. They're often held in suspicion that they deserve those jobs. And so all of these things would contribute to the sense that they don't deserve those jobs or they don't deserve to get paid for them, which would bring them from high happiness ratings to more like depression ratings. And so right off the bat, we would expect this ideology that people ought to be happy to count against people who are already being discriminated against. So not only are they being discriminated against based on skin color or ethnicity or religion or sexuality and so on, but we would also see them discriminated against or disadvantaged by a system that believes that we ought to be happy all the time. So see, that's a double whammy for them. So just by looking at it again, we see that the ideology around depression and happiness reinforces the privilege and disadvantages that are already in our society. So it makes them even greater. So the distance between people who are privileged and who are disadvantaged, discriminated against, gets even further apart based on our ideology of depression. The next step of being a critical race psychologist has to do with recognizing that all psychological phenomena are social constructions. This is going to frustrate you if you believe that psychology is through and through a science. Now, just because psychological phenomena are studied using experimentation, remember those first steps when we were naming variables in depression and our value judgments about them. Depression is bad, happiness is good. Once we've made that formulation, depression is bad, happiness is good, that is not a scientific formulation. That is a value judgment. That is a social construction. In our country, we value independence, we value strength, we value contentment, and so on. This goes back 2,500 years in our country, or 250 years, excuse me, or 25 decades. But it could be different. There are other cultures, there are other countries that value different things, like I'm thinking of like an East or a Japanese culture where you don't show power, you show patience, or power is shown through restraint. And so in the United States, we show power by what we've accomplished, what we've done, the impact we've made. In Japan, you show power by refusing to make that kind of a splash. So it's like a subdued power. The power is implied, it's not forceful, it's not outward. And so value judgments are what allow us to classify some behaviors as normal and some behaviors as pathological or abnormal. The very idea that we have a classification system for psychology, for abnormal and normal psychology, or we have some behaviors that are considered normal and some that are considered abnormal, those are value judgments based on what's commonly seen and how we define commonly seen. So what groups we're looking at when we determine what's normal. You know, for example, 100 years ago that IQ tests measured affluent, white, urban dwelling people. So people in like Upper East Side of New York City, for example, or San Francisco or San Diego or Los Angeles. They weren't looking at the margins. They weren't looking at people in poverty. People in poverty were in principle less intelligent simply because the measures weren't defined by who they were defined by who their peers were across town in poorer areas. So when we think about depression, when we think about anxiety, when we think about development, we need to remember that these are not scientific facts. They are social constructions, which means they come from somewhere. They privilege some people and some ways of knowing, and they could be another way. We could understand development in a very different way had we began with different assumptions and had we used different samples or different populations. So that's two. We recognize the privileges inherent in patterns in psychology, and we recognize that all psychological phenomena are social constructions. Number three, we need to see how psychological culture, so what we do in psychology, the science of psychology, for example, or clinical psychology, how that influences society more broadly. Well, the very idea that we name some behaviors, such as being sad, as pathological, now it influences people who are not psychologists, people who are just going about their normal life. Maybe they're a teacher, maybe they're a nurse, maybe they're a plumber, and they're learning that these scientists are doing experiments to show that sadness can be unlearned. Sadness can be reversed. I could be happier. And so what's happening in these laboratories is reinforcing this ideology that you should be happy, that there's no reason to feel sad. And so people that have never picked up a psychology book are learning about this when they read advertisements, for example, when they watch television and someone's sad and everyone tries to help them. It's reinforced repeatedly that sadness is a problem. So it started off as an ideology of American psychiatry. It was tested as a scientific phenomenon. And then once it was established as a scientific understanding or scientific principle, it filtered down through society, through television, through books, through magazines, through interviews, through social media. We are inundated with this ideology everywhere we turn, even though we're not hearing it from psychologists, but we're hearing it repeated in all of our conversations. And it's gotten so bad that if someone asks you how you're doing, you're almost embarrassed to say that you're having a bad day. Now, Gen Z is a little bit different, but millennials, my generation, it was like taboo to say you're sad or you're having a bad day, because then everyone tries to help you or put you on some sort of a medication. All right, and then the final thing, that filtering into society, that can reverse, and now that strong social push that depression is bad, for example, now it starts to influence the practice of psychology. So it's a loop, and it's a particularly pernicious loop. That loop looks like this right now. Depression is bad, and Science shows that depression can be reversed with psychotherapy or medicine, right? We know that. But do we? That's actually a belief in American society, and there's no evidence for it in science. So there have been large scale National Institute of Mental Health funded many year studies looking at whether or not psychotherapy influences depression. And when you look at all of these studies, so meta-analyses, so looking at thousands of patients, thousands of clients who were clinically depressed, who went under psychotherapy, a whole variety of psychotherapeutic styles, so counseling methods, and then were tested later to see if their depression had changed, there was no effective change. There was no statistically significant change. In other words, psychotherapy didn't help. Yet, were you to ask somebody, does psychotherapy help with depression? I would guess, because this is all over social media, I would guess that they would say absolutely. Yeah, you need to see someone if you're having signs or symptoms of depression, even though there's no evidence for this. And so talk to psychologists, and even though they're the ones conducting the experiments that have demonstrated no statistically significant effect, they will say, yes, it works, because socially we believe that it works. And so now the entire system is based on a principle that began as ideology. It filtered down through media and television, magazines, and so on into society, and was reinforced and then given back to the scientists. And so this entire edifice in psychology has become this own self-perpetuating cycle. How do we break out of that? Well, the science can't break us out of it because the science is inconclusive. Society can't break out of it because they're looking to the science for direction, but really they're the ones perpetuating it. And so you see how it's kind of a blind circle that's just continuing on and on. But this is how a critical psychologist looks at something like depression. Now, the next step is to look at how is race implicated in that? And that's going to be your challenge. But there's still two more ways that we can look at depression in the Black community to help you come up with your own formulations. All right, so there's two more aspects. They're both looking at something culturally or from a cultural lens. We've looked right now at from a critical lens. Let's move on to the cultural lens. The first idea is a normalizing context for what's considered abnormal behavior. So when we think about depression, we believe in our country, and this is supported by psychiatry, we believe that depression is abnormal. And once you believe that, it's almost as if you're dealing with a fact. Depression is abnormal. There's no challenging that. In order to normalize this, we need to remember that the abnormal was a value judgment that was made years and years ago. So we need to accept that it could just as easily, like what is considered normal could just as easily be considered abnormal, and the reverse. So what we do is take this category of abnormality, so depression is considered abnormal, and it's a problem, it's evidence of a disorder, and ask ourselves, what would it mean for this to be normal? How can we normalize this? Well, it would mean that it's okay to be sad. It's not evidence of a problem. It's not evidence of a disorder to be sad. It's not evidence of a disorder to have doubts. It's not evidence of a disorder to feel run down or have low energy. It's not evidence of a disorder to suddenly not enjoy spending time with your friends. Notice what I'm doing is challenging the ideology that depression is evidence of a disorder or a psychological illness. It's saying depression is part of the scope of human existence. We might even go so far as to say that being happy all the time is abnormal. Notice what I've done. I've taken these categories that are commonly accepted to represent normal and abnormal, normal being happy, abnormal being depressed, and I've switched them to the point where if you met someone that every day they're like having the best day of their life, you'd say, I'm happy for you, but I think there's something wrong with your perspective. If you're able to look at every disappointment in life optimistically, and I feel like maybe you're missing the significance of something. So what I'm doing here is challenging the ideology that depression is bad and happiness is good. And so that's normalizing what we ordinarily consider abnormal. The second is to denaturalize patterns that mainstream psychology claims to be scientific. Denaturalizing. When I talked about the way that depression has been studied in a laboratory, I pointed out that the very first step is to have a value statement about depression being good or bad, and then to define depression as a list of symptoms. I said 7. I think there's 9 actually, and many of those are broken down further into as many as 7. Those symptoms we have used to define depression, but those symptoms are subjective, which means I cannot tell if you are exhibiting or feeling those symptoms. I might be able to see that you're not eating as much, but I don't know if that's unusual for you. Only you can decide that. So symptoms are subjective. They belong to the client. And so it's the client reflecting on their experiences and saying, yes, here, no, here, maybe there. That's what a depression inventory accomplishes. And that's not scientific. That's not controlled. We don't trust the subject that way. We don't trust the subject who's not a psychiatrist, who doesn't have a PhD in psychology, to reflect on their experiences and report how they're feeling honestly, because they could be biased in a whole bunch of different ways. Maybe they just want medication, and so they're malingering, they're pretending to have an illness. We can't trust them the way that we think about research and the practice of science. So everything we know about depression is based on this assumption that clients can reflect honestly on their experiences and their feelings and report those objectively, even though that whole process is subjective, which means subject to their own interpretation, which isn't quite as rigorous as yours and mine as studying psychology. So when we look at depression this way, in the science of depression, we realize that it's not a phenomenon, a scientific phenomenon, the same way that, let's say, gravity is, where anybody who has the tools can demonstrate the phenomenon of gravity, or anyone can demonstrate the phenomenon of mass, so that things have mass and mass can be measured. There's no room for interpretation there. It's simply using the tools correctly or incorrectly. But with psychology, there's all this interpretation and uncertainty that's part of that process. So it's really not a through and through scientific process. And I've actually written articles about that. So that's 6 things, and each of those steps, and I'll write them out for you, and I've gone through all of them with a few examples, but all of those are ways of looking at a phenomenon, a psychological phenomenon, through a critical lens. And then when we look at the way that race is implicated, or racist ideology is reinforced in that process, we're doing critical race psychology. So here's my challenge to you. If you've followed along this far, my challenge to you is this. Think about the Black community and mental health. And you'll probably think something like this. The Black community is suspicious of mental health. They're suspicious of depression being a disorder. They're suspicious of recognizing that disorder and then seeking help. They're suspicious of the entire counseling. I'm generalizing here. They're suspicious of the entire counseling enterprise, that you would go to someone outside of your family, share something personal, and they would help you. Well, there might be some manipulation there. They might be taking advantage of me. I don't really need their help. There's all of this suspicion that surrounds psychology and clinical psychology and counseling professions, and even medication in the Black community. Now, when we look at that from American Psychiatric Association, or from the American Psychiatric Association, there's a belief, an ideology, that this suspicion about counseling psychology that's held by the Black community is wrong. They are misinformed. We need a movement to help the Black community appreciate what counseling can afford. That right there is privileging the status quo, which puts people or white people in control. It privileges white people, and it disadvantages people of color. So the very system, we've already gone through that. Yet we want the Black community that recognizes that they're being disadvantaged in this and are therefore rightfully suspicious. We want them to change their mentality. So let's create a program to help teach them that that psychotherapy is actually good. So we want more Black people going under therapy, seeing psychiatrists, getting medication, and so on. I want you to look at that belief system in the Black community, the suspicion about psychology, the suspicion about counseling and psychotherapy. I want you to look at that from a critical psychology perspective. In other words, in what ways might the Black community be suffering because of this belief that they should not be suspicious of counseling and psychotherapy? Um, how is racism being further ingrained or further perpetuated by the insistence that all Americans, regardless of race and skin color, trust the medical psychiatric system? I want you to look at depression and treatment in the Black community from a critical race psychology perspective. And I would love to hear your own unique, creative take on what some of the consequences of doing that are.